The supermini segment might be about little tiny cars, but it's about great big sales. It accounts for about 25% of UK car sales annually, which is a lot. And in that segment, Toyota account for about 2% of car sales annually, which is not a lot, but that's largely because they've been flogging the old Starlet, which is rubbish. The company's built a reputation more for producing very well constructed, if rather bland, large cars and some pretty handy sports cars. And then along comes this, the little Yaris, and it's something rather different. Make no bones about it, Toyota mean business in the European market with this. They've been crafty. They had it designed in Europe to appeal to our European eyes. And it's another high roof and low floor line concept. That means enormous doors, getting in and out is easy. Probably the only flaw for me in what is a very well resolved design outside is these oversized large headlamps. They look like somebody's used too much glue to stick them on. But there are some very nice design touches. I love the way this grille is beautifully integrated into the body and not just slapped on the front like on some. I also love the way that the creases and curves that define the shape are subtly executed. It's understated, unlike some in its class where the creases and curves there mean they will date inside of a year. And the same can be said for the interior, where it's definitely benefited from the touch of a designer's pen, and again a European designer. But there's nothing over the top. Everything is functional. The dash is defined by these two broad sweeping arches punctuated by these rather Flash Gordon air vents. Everything is neatly laid out, comes to hand and feels really quite robust. In order to make maximum use of the width of the cabin, Toyota have more or less done away with door bins. There's just a tiny little slim one. But you don't lose out on your storage space. This is so clever. There is space absolutely everywhere in what is a very clever cabin layout. But there's one big shock waiting for you as you settle behind the wheel. There's no clocks. They're here, and boy is this clever. The essential information for the driver and the console has been moved into the very centre and angled towards the driver, and the digital display that gives you miles an hour, revs, fuel and distance travelled has been designed to be three-dimensional. It doesn't need your eyes to refocus. You look away from the road and you look to the display, you look back again, there's less time taken, you don't have to refocus. It's very clever. Like a Formula One car takes to the track, a duck to water, and a footballer to recreational drugs, the little Yaris takes to the city streets as if it was born there. It's its natural habitat, its environment. Which means it comes with all the more of a surprise that the rear view visibility is dreadful. It's as a result of the shape of the car, and it means really for manoeuvring around the city it's pretty bad. But the plus side is that that shape results in a pretty commanding driving position. You are sitting quite high up, you have a commanding view of the road in front. You feel you're sitting in a car that's 4 or 5 times the size of this thing, which is quite a neat trick really. There's nothing exciting under the bonnet in terms of performance, but then you wouldn't expect it to be. It's a 1 litre 16 valve unit. Interestingly, from a technological point of view, it does have variable valve timing, which I suspect has been given more of a bias towards economy than performance. Again, that's only what you'd expect. If it gets a little bit twisty, on the odd occasion you take a car like this on the country roads, it performs reasonably well. It's certainly not as rolly and wallowy as the high centre of gravity appearance might imply, but that's because actually the centre of gravity isn't that high at all. A lot of work has obviously gone into keeping it fairly low down. Dynamically, it's not a bad package at all. The overwhelming impression in here is one of space and size. I can't emphasise that despite the diminutive looking interior, get in this thing and take it for a spin and you will be amazed. You feel like you've got into a people carrier, something as big as that. Now let's get to grips with just how much space there is in this thing. Bear in mind, it's a super mini. I'm not a tall guy, but I've had 6'2" mates sat in the back of this thing. No problem with headroom and no problem with room around you generally, which is pretty impressive. Also impressive is the boot space. Not as compromised as you might expect, considering the amount of cabin space you've got available, but it does get a little more clever than that. If that isn't enough space for you, the rear seats will go forwards, and if that isn't enough, we get the headrests off. 1, 2. It's a 60/40 fold rear seat, which gives you even more flexibility. And if that isn't enough, well then, I'd say that should be. There'll be 4 trim levels in the UK, familiar to those who already know their Toyotas. That means S, GS, GLS and CVX. Prices start at £7,495 on the road and rise to £10,995. And there's an interval of £1,000 between each of the trim levels, so you can probably work it out for yourself. There's an option of 3 or 5 door. It'll cost you an extra £500 for the extra 2 doors. The little Yaris is truly innovative. It's a new take on the idea of a city car. It offers a level of practicality that you will not find in a package this small. The looks might not be to everyone's taste, but I'd say they're certainly less radical than some out there, and there's very little about the car that is simply design for design's sake. With Toyota's reputation for building quality cars, there's no doubt that Yaris really will be as tough as it looks. There's an important factor to consider here. Over 90% of the sales of this car are expected to go to private buyers. In other words, it needs to appeal to real people rather than the corporate checkbooks. To do that, it has to be a bit special. In the supermini sector, we display a lot of brand loyalty. How many times do you hear people saying, "I've always had them and I always will, regardless"? To break through in that kind of market, it needs to do something a bit special, and I think it does. I think it is genuinely innovative in its approach to being a city car and the way it goes about doing it, without being radically different, for the sake of being radically different, as in Ford's car. It wipes the floor, I think, with most of the opposition. It's very competitively priced. Probably its biggest opponent is Volkswagen's lovely Lupo, and if this can beat that, I think it's a winner.